Lyra didn't know that the servant uniform she wore made her invisible to everyone except him. She didn't know that the man watching her from across the ballroom had memorized every detail of her face during their secret meetings in the palace gardens. And she certainly didn't know that when she whispered, "Pretend you don't know me," she was asking the Alpha King himself to deny their bond. The crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light across the marble floors of the grand ballroom, their brilliance reflecting off silk gowns and ceremonial armor. Hundreds of guests filled the space, visiting Alphas with their retinues, noble families displaying their wealth, diplomats negotiating alliances through careful conversation and calculated smiles. The annual royal summit had drawn the most powerful shifters from across the realm, all seeking audience with the Alpha King. Lyra moved between them like a ghost, her simple grey dress and white apron marking her as palace staff. She carried a silver tray of crystal glasses filled with blood wine, the traditional drink served at formal gatherings. The liquid caught the light like liquid rubies as she navigated through clusters of conversation, invisible to those who mattered. But not to him. Her breath caught as their eyes met across the crowded space. Even from this distance, even surrounded by hundreds of people, that familiar warmth bloomed in her chest. The golden thread that had been pulling her toward the gardens every night for 3 months now sang between them, impossible to ignore. He stood near the throne, dressed in midnight blue velvet with silver embroidery that caught the light when he moved. The ceremonial crown sat easily on his dark hair, and she could see the way other guests deferred to him, the careful space they maintained around him. Everything about his bearing spoke of absolute authority, of power so complete it needed no demonstration. Marcus. Her Marcus, who had held her hand under starlight and whispered about dreams he couldn't tell his advisers, who had traced the lines of her palm and asked about her childhood, her fears, her hopes for a future she'd never dared imagine. Except he wasn't just Marcus. The realization hit her like cold water. The way the other servants had whispered about the king's unusual behaviour lately, his distraction during court sessions, his tendency to disappear into the gardens at night. The way her heart had recognised him before her mind caught up. She was in love with the Alpha King. More wine. The sharp command snapped her back to the present. Lord Aldrich, a visiting Alpha from the Eastern Territories, held out his empty glass without looking at her. His pale eyes were fixed on a group of young noblewomen across the room, calculating which alliance might prove most profitable. Lyra moved to refill his glass, hand steady despite the chaos in her mind. She had become expert at being invisible, at moving through the nobility without drawing attention. It was a skill that had kept her alive for 20 years. Clumsy servant. The accusation came from Lord Breton, another visiting Alpha whose territory bordered Lord Aldrich's. He was younger, hungrier, with the kind of cruel smile that suggested he enjoyed wielding power over those who couldn't fight back. "Look what you've done." Lyra looked down in horror. Dark red wine stained the front of Lord Breton's cream-coloured doublet, spreading across the expensive silk like blood. She hadn't even felt the glass slip from her tray. "I'm so sorry, my lord." The words came automatically, along with a deep curtsy that made her hands shake. "Please, let me. You'll do nothing." Lord Breton's voice carried across nearby conversations, drawing attention from other guests. Several nobles turned to watch, their expressions ranging from mild interest to cruel amusement. "Stupid girl, do you have any idea what this doublet cost?" "I'll replace it," Lyra whispered, though they both knew she couldn't. A servant's wages for an entire year wouldn't cover a garment like that. "Please, You'll be whipped for this." Lord Breton stepped closer, and she could smell the wine on his breath, see the satisfaction in his eyes as fear flickered across her face. 10 lashes for clumsiness, 20 for ruining my clothes, and another 10 for speaking without permission. 40 lashes. Lyra's knees nearly buckled. She'd seen servants after punishment like that. If they survived, they never walked quite the same again. "Release her." The voice came from behind Lord Breton, low and deadly quiet. The surrounding conversations died as other guests turned to look, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. Lyra's heart stopped. She knew that voice, had heard it whisper her name in the darkness, had felt it rumble through his chest when she pressed her ear to his heart during their stolen moments in the garden. Lord Breton spun around, his face flushing red as he realised who had spoken. "Your Majesty." The title came out strained. "I was simply addressing a disciplinary matter with this servant." "Release her." Each word was enunciated with deadly precision. The Alpha King stepped into view, and Lyra saw the way his presence seemed to fill the space around him, drawing every eye in their vicinity. His dark eyes held Lord Breton's gaze without wavering, and something in that stare made the other Alpha take an involuntary step backward. "Of course, Your Majesty." Lord Breton's voice had lost its cruel confidence. "Though the damage to my clothing will be replaced from my personal funds." The King's gaze shifted to Lyra for just a moment, and she saw something there that made her breath catch: recognition, concern, and something deeper, something that made the golden thread between them sing with warmth. "The matter is resolved." It wasn't a suggestion. Lord Breton bowed stiffly and melted back into the crowd, his expression murderous but his protests silenced by royal authority. The other guests returned to their conversations, though Lyra could feel their curious glances, the whispered speculation about why their king would intervene for a servant. She should curtsy, should thank him and disappear before anyone connected her to his unusual mercy, should pretend, as he taught her in the garden, that they were strangers who'd never shared secrets under moonlight. Instead, she found herself frozen as he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the concern flickering in his dark eyes, could catch the familiar scent of cedar and rain that always surrounded him. "Are you hurt?" The question was pitched low, meant only for her ears. She shook her head, not trusting her voice. Around them, the gala continued, but she felt as though they existed in a bubble separate from the rest of the world, just as they had in the garden, when nothing mattered except the space between them and the way her heart raced when he smiled. But they weren't in the garden now. They were surrounded by hundreds of guests, by nobles and diplomats who would dissect every interaction for political advantage, by people who would never understand how a servant could capture a king's attention. "Pretend you don't know me," she whispered desperately, the words barely audible above the music and conversation surrounding them. Her eyes darted to the faces watching them, to Lord Breton's furious expression, to the calculating looks of the noble ladies who had been vying for royal attention all evening. "Please, just pretend." He stepped closer, close enough that his presence blocked out the rest of the room, close enough that when he reached out, his fingers brushed against hers as he took the wine tray from her trembling hands. "I know you better than anyone else in this room," he said softly, his breath warm against her ear as he leaned down. The words sent heat racing through her veins, familiar and devastating and impossible to ignore. "And I'm done pretending." The golden thread between them flared bright enough that she wondered if others could see it, this connection that had been growing stronger every night they met in secret. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining in a gesture so natural it felt like breathing. Around them, the ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Lyra was dimly aware of the stares, of the shocked whispers beginning to ripple outward from their small circle of space. But all she could focus on was the warmth of his touch and the way his eyes held hers as though she was the only person in the room who mattered, as though she was precious instead of invisible, as though she was everything instead of nothing. The Alpha King had just claimed her in front of his entire court, and there was no going back. The ballroom felt like a trap closing around her. Every eye in their vicinity had turned toward them, nobles straining to witness whatever drama was unfolding between their king and a servant girl. Lyra could feel the weight of their stares, the whispered speculation beginning to spread like wildfire through the crowd. "Come with me." His voice was steady, but she could hear the underlying tension, the careful control he maintained, even as the court watched his every move. His hand remained wrapped around hers, warm and solid and impossibly reassuring, despite the chaos threatening to consume them both. She wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed at her to pull away, to disappear into the crowd before this moment could destroy them both. But the golden thread between them pulled tight, and she found herself nodding instead, following him as he led her through the sea of curious faces. He guided her toward a side entrance, away from the main doors where departing guests might intercept them. The music continued behind them, but the conversations had shifted. Hundreds of voices now focused on dissecting what they'd just witnessed. By morning, every noble house in the kingdom would know that the Alpha King had publicly defended a servant. The corridor beyond the ballroom was blessedly quiet, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. Lyra had walked these passages countless times while performing her duties, but everything felt different now, charged, dangerous. "Where are we going?" she whispered, though she already knew. There was only one place they could speak freely, where the walls held their secrets and the night air carried away their whispered confessions. "Somewhere we can talk without an audience." He glanced back at her, and in the lamplight she could see the tension around his eyes, the weight of whatever decision he was carrying. "Somewhere I can explain." The garden entrance stood open to the night air, just as it had every evening when she'd slipped away from her duties to meet him. But tonight felt different. Tonight the shadows seemed deeper, the moonlight more revealing. Tonight everything between them was about to change. He stopped beside the fountain where they'd shared their first kiss 3 weeks ago, when the wine festival had left the palace staff with lighter duties and her heart with dangerous hope. The water sparkled in the moonlight, just as it had that night when he'd cupped her face and whispered that he'd been waiting his whole life to find her. "Look at me," he said softly, and she realized she'd been staring at the ground, afraid to meet his eyes now that the fantasy was crumbling around them. When she finally lifted her gaze, her breath caught. In the ballroom, surrounded by courtiers and ceremony, he had looked every inch the powerful ruler. But here, with moonlight silvering his dark hair and worry creasing his brow, he looked like Marcus again. Her Marcus, who had held her while she cried about nightmares she couldn't explain, and who had shared stories about the loneliness of command that he'd never told another soul. Except he wasn't just Marcus, he never had been. "I'm not who you think I am," he said, and the words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of realization through her chest. "I know." The admission tore itself from her throat before she could stop it. "I figured it out tonight, the way they deferred to you, the crown, the way you commanded Lord Breton without even raising your voice." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm night air. "You're him, the Alpha King, the most powerful shifter in the realm." He took a step closer, and she could see the pain flickering in his dark eyes. "I wanted to tell you. Every night we met here, every conversation we shared, I wanted to tell you the truth, but I was afraid." "Afraid?" The word came out sharper than she intended. "You're the king. What could you possibly be afraid of?" "Losing you." The confession was barely a whisper, but it hit her with the force of a shout. "Losing this. Losing the way you look at me when you don't know what I am, when you see just me. Not the crown or the power or the political calculations, just Marcus, who makes you laugh when he tells terrible jokes about court etiquette." Despite everything, her lips almost curved into a smile. He did tell terrible jokes, stories about pompous ambassadors and ridiculous ceremony that made her forget for brief moments that their worlds were impossibly far apart. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why would you want this, want me? I clean floors and serve wine and sleep in a servant's quarters with 3 other girls. I'm nobody." "Don't." The word came out rough, almost desperate. "Don't say that. Don't reduce yourself to what others see when they look at you." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. Close enough that the bond between them hummed with intensity, making her pulse race despite her confusion. "Did you think I cared about titles when you held my hand during that thunderstorm 2 weeks ago?" he asked softly. "When you stayed with me in this garden while the rain poured down and I told you about the nightmares I've had since my father died? Did you think crowns mattered when you showed me how to see starlight reflected in puddles, when you made me laugh for the first time in months?" The memory hit her like a physical blow. That night, he'd seemed so lost, so burdened by grief he couldn't share with anyone else. She'd found him here by accident, drawn by the sound of someone in pain, and somehow they'd ended up talking until dawn about loss and loneliness and dreams they'd never dared voice. "That was real," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "Every conversation, every stolen moment, every time I counted the hours until I could see you again, that was real, the most real thing in my life. But you're the king." The words felt heavy on her tongue, weighted with all the impossibility they represented. "And I'm just my mate." The declaration stopped her breath in her lungs. "I've spent 3 months falling in love with your soul, learning the way you think, memorizing the sound of your laugh. I know you bite your lip when you're nervous, that you hum while you work, that you cry during thunderstorms because they remind you of something you won't talk about. I know you're brave and kind and stronger than you believe." He reached up to cup her face in his hands, thumbs brushing across her cheekbones with devastating gentleness. "Learning you're a servant doesn't change that you're my mate. It doesn't change that the bond chose you. It doesn't change that I love you." The words hung between them in the moonlit air, impossible and perfect and terrifying. Lyra felt tears she hadn't realized were falling streaked down her cheeks, felt the golden thread between them flare so bright it almost hurt. "I love you too," she whispered, the confession torn from somewhere deep in her chest. "But love isn't enough. Kings don't marry servants. You have duties, responsibilities, a kingdom to think about. You need someone who can stand beside you as an equal, someone who can help you rule. I need you." The conviction in his voice was absolute. "I need someone who sees beyond the crown, who challenges me to be better, who reminds me that power is meant to protect, not control. I need someone who makes me feel human instead of just a symbol." He leaned down until his forehead rested against hers, until they shared the same breath, the same space, the same desperate hope. "Stay," he whispered. "When this is over, when we figure out how to make this work, stay. Choose me, not because I'm a king, but because I'm the man who loves you more than his own life." Before she could answer, before she could voice any of the dozen fears still racing through her mind, footsteps echoed from the palace entrance, multiple sets moving quickly, accompanied by the low murmur of urgent voices. They broke apart just as 3 figures emerged into the moonlight. Lyra recognized them immediately. Lord Chancellor Aldwyn, the king's most trusted adviser, flanked by 2 members of the royal guard. Their faces were grim, their postures tense with barely contained worry. "Your Majesty," Lord Aldwyn said, relief evident in his voice as his eyes found the king. "We've been searching for you. There are urgent matters that require your attention." His gaze shifted to Lyra, and she saw the moment he recognized her, not as an individual, but as a problem, a complication that threatened the smooth operation of his carefully ordered world. "Of course," the king replied smoothly, but Lyra could hear the frustration threading through his voice. The real world had found them, just as she'd known it would. "I'll be there shortly." "Your Majesty," Lord Aldwyn pressed, "Lady Cordelia and her father are asking for a private audience. They're quite insistent about discussing the potential alliance." "I said I'll be there shortly." The authority in the king's voice was unmistakable, the kind of power that had commanded armies and shaped kingdoms. Even Lord Aldwyn took a step back. But the message was clear. Duty called. Politics waited for no one, not even kings in love with servants. The officials retreated, but not before Lord Aldwyn cast one more meaningful look at Lyra. A look that said he understood exactly what kind of threat she represented to their carefully laid plans. When they were alone again, the king turned back to her, reaching for her hands. But the spell was broken. The real world had intruded on their garden sanctuary, bringing with it all the reasons why this could never work. "I have to go," he said quietly. "I know." She stepped back, putting distance between them, even though it felt like tearing away part of her soul. "Your kingdom needs you. Your people need you. You need me too." It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact that made her chest ache with longing. "What I need doesn't matter." The words tasted bitter on her tongue, but they were true. "You're the Alpha King. You belong to your people first." He started to protest, but she was already backing toward the palace entrance, toward the servants' quarters, where she could hide among her own kind and pretend her heart wasn't breaking. "This doesn't end here," he called after her, his voice carrying across the garden like a promise. "I meant what I said, Lyra, every word." She paused at the threshold, memorizing the sight of him standing in the moonlight, looking every inch the powerful ruler and the gentle man she'd fallen in love with. Both of them real, both of them impossible to reconcile with the life of a servant girl who dared to dream beyond her station. "I know," she whispered back, "but knowing doesn't change what we are, what we can never be." Then she fled into the safety of shadows, leaving the Alpha King alone in the garden with the weight of 2 kingdoms and the echo of her footsteps fading into the night. Dawn came too soon, painting the servant quarters in pale grey light that did nothing to soften the harsh reality of the previous night. Lyra had barely slept, her mind replaying every moment in the garden until the memory felt worn thin from handling. The Alpha King's voice echoed in her head, "I love you," but in the cold light of morning those words felt like fragments of a dream. She dressed in her usual grey uniform, fingers trembling as she fastened the white apron that marked her as palace staff. Around her, the other servant girls whispered excitedly about the spectacle at the gala, about how the king had defended some serving girl from Lord Breton's wrath. Did you see her face? Mira, a kitchen maid with honey-coloured hair, leaned forward conspiratorially. "White as milk when Lord Breton grabbed her, thought she was going to faint right there." "I heard the king paid for the damaged clothing himself," added Sarah, who cleaned the guest chambers. "Can you imagine the most powerful alpha in the realm concerned about wine stains on some lord's doublet?" Lyra kept her eyes down, focusing on braiding her dark hair into the simple style required of servants. Let them gossip, let them speculate. As long as no one connected her to the girl from the ballroom, she could disappear back into invisibility. But even as she told herself this, she could feel the weight of curious glances, the way conversations quieted when she passed. Word travelled fast in the palace, and servants had sharp eyes for anything unusual. "Strange behaviour for a king," muttered Elena, the eldest of their group, as she pinned her grey hair beneath a white cap. "Makes you wonder what's gotten into him lately. All those late nights, the distraction during court sessions." The golden thread in Lyra's chest pulled tight, responding to the mention of him even in this roundabout way. She pressed her hand against her ribs, trying to still the ache that had settled there since she'd fled the garden. The morning passed in a blur of routine tasks, scrubbing floors, changing linens, preparing chambers for the noble guests who would remain for several more days of negotiations. Lyra threw herself into the work, grateful for anything that might quiet the chaos in her mind. But even mundane duties couldn't shield her from the conversations swirling through the palace corridors. Every noble she passed seemed to be discussing the king's unusual behaviour, dissecting his intervention the previous night with the kind of political calculation that made her stomach turn. "Most peculiar," she heard Lord Aldrich saying to a cluster of visiting alphas as she changed the water in their sitting room. "In all my years of court politics, I've never seen a monarch involve himself so personally in servant discipline." Perhaps he was simply ensuring proper hospitality, suggested another voice, though it carried little conviction. Or perhaps, came a third voice, silky with implication, our king has developed inappropriate attachments. Lyra's hands went still on the crystal pitcher she was refilling. That last voice belonged to Lady Cordelia Ravencrest, daughter of Duke Ravencrest and the most politically advantageous marriage prospect currently at court. Lyra had served her dinner the previous evening, had seen the calculating way she'd watched the king throughout the meal. "Surely you don't mean to suggest—" Lord Aldrich began. "I suggest nothing," Lady Cordelia replied smoothly. "I merely observe, and what I observe is a king who seems distracted, unfocused on the matters that should command his attention." Through the archway, Lyra caught a glimpse of the woman who spoke. Lady Cordelia was everything she herself was not, tall and elegant, with golden hair that caught light like spun metal and the kind of refined beauty that graced portrait paintings. Her silk gown probably cost more than Lyra would earn in 5 years, and she wore it with the unconscious grace of someone born to luxury. "The king requires a strong partner," Lady Cordelia continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Someone who understands the political landscape, who can strengthen alliances rather than complicate them." The words hit like physical blows. Lyra finished her task quickly and slipped away, but Lady Cordelia's voice followed her down the corridor, laying out all the reasons why a king needed a queen who could match him in power, in breeding, in the complex dance of court politics. All the reasons why a servant girl was not just unsuitable, but dangerous. The rest of the morning brought a parade of similar conversations. Nobles discussing the king's duty to marry well, to produce heirs, to cement alliances that would secure the kingdom's future. With each overheard comment, the golden thread in Lyra's chest grew heavier, weighted with the crushing reality of what stood between them. It was nearly noon when she was summoned to the main hall for an unusual assembly. All palace staff had been called together, from the highest-ranking stewards to the newest scullery maids. They stood in nervous clusters, while Lord Chancellor Aldwyn addressed them from the raised dais usually reserved for royal proclamations. "There has been an incident," he announced, his weathered face grave with concern. "A valuable necklace has gone missing from Lady Cordelia's chambers. The moonstone of Ravencrest, a family heirloom worth more than most of you will earn in a lifetime." Murmurs rippled through the assembled servants. Lyra's blood went cold as she realised what was happening, what this carefully orchestrated scene was designed to accomplish. "The necklace was last seen yesterday evening," Lord Aldwyn continued. "Security has been reviewing who had access to the ladies' chambers during that time. We will now conduct a thorough search of all staff quarters." The guards moved efficiently, clearly having planned this moment in advance. They worked through the servant quarters methodically, checking personal belongings with the kind of thoroughness that suggested they knew exactly what they were looking for. When they reached Lyra's small trunk, her heart was already pounding with dread. She watched in frozen horror as the guard's hand closed around something hidden beneath her extra apron, something that caught the light like captured starfire. The moonstone of Ravencrest. An intricate silver necklace set with a pendant that seemed to hold moonlight within its crystalline depths. Beautiful, priceless, and completely foreign to anything she'd ever owned. "Well, well," Lord Aldwyn said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall. "It seems we've found our thief." The words hit Lyra like a physical blow, but it was the faces around her that truly broke her heart. Fellow servants she'd worked alongside for months, people who'd shared meals and stories and small kindnesses, now staring at her with shock and betrayal. "I didn't steal it," she whispered, though she knew how hollow the denial sounded. "I've never seen that necklace before in my life. Someone must have—" "Planted it," Lord Aldwyn's tone suggested the idea was absurd. Why would anyone frame a simple serving girl for theft? What possible motive could they have? But Lyra knew. She could see it in the calculating satisfaction that flickered across his features, in the way his eyes held hers, with something that might have been pity if it weren't so cold. Someone had decided she was a problem that needed solving. Someone had decided that a servant with inconvenient connections needed to disappear. "The punishment for theft of this magnitude," Lord Aldwyn announced to the assembled crowd, "is exile from the kingdom. However, given the particular value of the stolen item and the breach of trust it represents—" He let the words hang in the air, heavy with implication. Exile, if she was lucky. If she wasn't— "I demand trial before the King's court," Lyra said suddenly, the words tearing themselves from her throat before fear could silence them. It was her right as a palace servant, though one rarely invoked. Most preferred swift punishment to the uncertain mercy of royal judgment. Lord Aldwyn's eyes narrowed slightly. "That is unusual. Most who are caught red-handed prefer to accept their punishment and be done with it." "I'm innocent," Lyra replied, lifting her chin despite the tremor in her voice. "If I must face judgment, let it be before the highest authority in the realm." Something flickered across the Chancellor's face. Surprise, perhaps, or irritation that his careful plan had developed a complication. But he couldn't refuse her request, not in front of witnesses, not when she'd invoked her legal rights. "Very well," he said after a long moment. "You will be confined until the King can hear your case. Guards, escort her to the holding chamber." As the guards moved to flank her, Lyra caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. Lady Cordelia stood in the doorway, watching the proceedings with the kind of satisfied smile that confirmed every suspicion forming in Lyra's mind. This wasn't random. This wasn't about a stolen necklace. This was about removing an obstacle to political necessity, about eliminating a complication that threatened carefully laid plans. The holding chamber was small and windowless, lit by a single oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. Lyra sat on the narrow bench and tried to slow her racing heart, tried to think through the maze of political calculation that had led to this moment. Someone had discovered her connection to the King. Someone had decided that a servant who'd captured royal attention was a threat that needed neutralizing. The necklace was just the weapon they'd chosen. Elegant, untraceable, and guaranteed to result in her permanent removal from the palace. Hours passed before she heard footsteps in the corridor outside, the heavy tread of guards, accompanied by the softer sound of someone in silk slippers. The key turned in the lock, and Lord Aldwyn entered, followed by 2 members of the royal guard. "The King will see you now," he announced, though his tone suggested this was a formality he'd rather skip. "Remember your place when you address His Majesty. Show proper respect, even as you face the consequences of your actions." They escorted her through corridors she'd walked countless times as a servant, but everything felt different now. The familiar passages seemed longer, more imposing, charged with a tension that made her skin prickle with awareness. The throne room doors opened before them like the maw of some great beast. Inside, the afternoon light streaming through tall windows illuminated a scene that might have been pulled from a painting. The Alpha King seated on his throne, the ancient symbol of power and authority, surrounded by the full regalia of court ceremony. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath in her lungs. Dark eyes that found hers across the vast space and held them with an intensity that made the golden thread between them sing with desperate harmony. He knew. Whatever careful facade they'd maintained, whatever distance she'd tried to create between them, he knew exactly what this was and what was at stake. The formal words of accusation washed over her as she stood in the centre of the great hall, flanked by guards, facing the man she loved across an impossible gulf of power and protocol. Lord Aldwyn recited her crimes with bureaucratic precision: theft, breach of trust, violation of the sacred hospitality extended to noble guests. Through it all, she kept her eyes on his face, memorizing the sharp line of his jaw, the way the light caught in his dark hair, the careful control he maintained even as she saw the storm building behind his expression. When Lord Aldwyn finished speaking, the silence stretched between them like a held breath. This was the moment when everything would change, when the careful balance they'd maintained would either shatter completely or transform into something new. "These are serious charges," the king said finally, his voice carrying easily through the vast space. "Theft of a noble's property strikes at the heart of the trust that binds our society together." Lyra's heart cracked a little more with each word. This was what she'd expected, what she'd prepared herself for during the long hours in the holding chamber. He was the king first, the man who'd whispered love words in moonlit gardens second. Duty demanded he uphold justice, even when it meant destroying them both. "However," he continued, and something in his tone made her lift her eyes to his face again, "I find the circumstances of this case peculiar." Lord Aldwyn shifted slightly, the first sign of discomfort Lyra had ever seen from the unflappable Chancellor. "Your Majesty?" A servant with no previous incidents, no history of dishonesty, suddenly risks everything to steal a necklace she could never hope to sell or wear. The king's gaze moved from Lyra to Lord Aldwyn, then to the nobles gathered to witness the proceedings. "It strikes me as remarkably convenient that this theft occurred so soon after recent events." The weight behind those last words was unmistakable. Recent events, her defence at the gala, the public attention he'd drawn to her, the whispered speculation that had followed them both through the corridors of power. "Justice demands more than convenience," he continued, rising from his throne with fluid grace. "It demands truth, and I find myself unsatisfied with the truth as it has been presented." Lord Aldwyn's face had gone pale. "Your Majesty, surely the evidence speaks for itself." "The charges are dismissed." The king's voice cut through the Chancellor's protest with absolute authority. "This woman is under my personal protection. The matter is closed." The throne room erupted in shocked murmurs. Nobles who'd come to witness a servant's downfall instead found themselves witnessing something unprecedented, their king publicly declaring protection for a woman accused of theft. But it was Lady Cordelia's face that caught Lyra's attention. Beautiful features twisted with fury barely held in check, blue eyes blazing with the kind of rage that came from carefully laid plans crumbling into dust. The Alpha King had just chosen her over political expediency, over alliance and advantage, and the carefully orchestrated marriage that would strengthen his kingdom's borders. He had chosen love over duty, and in doing so he had made them both targets for every enemy he had. The chambers they gave her were nothing like the servant quarters she'd called home for so many years. Silk tapestries covered the stone walls, and a fire crackled in the marble hearth, casting golden light across furnishings that belonged in a noble suite. A four-poster bed dominated the space, its emerald curtains embroidered with silver thread that caught the firelight like captured starlight. "For your protection," Lord Aldwyn had said when the guards escorted her here, though his tone suggested he found the entire arrangement distasteful. "His Majesty's orders." Protection. The word sat heavy in her chest as she paced the length of the room, her simple servant's dress looking impossibly out of place among such luxury. She was trapped between two worlds now, no longer invisible among the palace staff, but not truly belonging to the nobility either. Through the tall windows she could see the garden where she'd met him every night for 3 months. The fountain sparkled in the afternoon light, innocent of the secrets it had witnessed, the promises whispered in its shadow. It felt like looking at another life, one that belonged to a different girl who'd believed love could conquer the impossible gulf between servant and king. A soft knock interrupted her brooding. She turned as the door opened to admit a young woman in a guard's uniform, someone she didn't recognise from the usual palace security. "Miss," the guard said quietly, closing the door behind her with careful precision. "I'm Captain Thorne. I've been assigned to your personal detail." "Personal detail?" Lyra almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "I'm a servant. I don't need—" "You need protection more than you know." Captain Thorne's expression was grim as she moved to the windows, checking the locks with professional efficiency. The King's public declaration has made you a target for anyone who sees advantage in your removal." The casual way she spoke of assassination attempts made Lyra's blood run cold. "I don't understand. I'm nobody special. I just serve wine and change bed linens." Captain Thorne turned from the windows, her grey eyes serious. "You're the woman the Alpha King publicly protected. In the eyes of every political player in this kingdom, that makes you either a valuable asset or a dangerous liability." Before Lyra could respond, another knock echoed through the chamber. Captain Thorne's hand moved to her sword hilt as she called out, "Who seeks entrance?" "Sir Marcus Blackwood, by order of His Majesty." Lyra's heart stumbled over the familiar name, the false identity he'd given her during their garden meetings. Even now, even after everything had changed, he was still finding ways to protect their secrets. Captain Thorne opened the door to admit a figure in a dark travelling cloak. When he pushed back the hood, Lyra's breath caught. Not the king in his royal regalia, but Marcus as she'd always known him. Hair slightly tousled, clothes practical rather than ceremonial, eyes warm with the kind of relief that came from seeing someone safe. "Leave us," he said quietly to Captain Thorne. "Your Majesty, I was ordered to maintain constant—" "I am the one who gave that order." His voice carried absolute authority, despite its gentle tone. "You may wait outside." When they were alone, he crossed the room in 3 quick strides and pulled her into his arms. For a moment, the political machinations and impossible circumstances faded away, leaving only the solid warmth of his embrace and the golden thread between them singing with relief. "Are you hurt?" He pulled back to study her face, hands cupping her cheeks with devastating gentleness. "When I heard about the accusation, about them confining you like a common criminal—" "I'm fine." She caught his hands in hers, marvelling at how natural the gesture felt despite everything that had changed between them. "But you shouldn't be here. If someone sees you visiting my chambers—" "Let them see." The conviction in his voice was absolute. "I'm done hiding, Lyra, done pretending that what we have is something to be ashamed of." She pulled away from his touch, wrapping her arms around herself as the weight of their situation crashed over her again. "You can't be done hiding. You're the king. You have responsibilities, a kingdom to think about. You need to marry Lady Cordelia, or someone like her, someone who can help you rule. I need you." He stepped closer, and she could see the storm building in his dark eyes. "I've spent the last 6 hours investigating who planted that necklace in your belongings. Do you want to know what I found?" "Does it matter?" The question came out sharper than she intended. "Even if you prove I'm innocent, even if you expose whoever framed me, it doesn't change the fundamental problem. I'm a servant. You're a king. Those 2 things can never—" "You're not a servant." The quiet conviction in his words stopped her breath. "What?" "The investigation led me to some interesting discoveries." He moved to a leather satchel she hadn't noticed him carrying and withdrew a small object wrapped in silk. "Tell me, Lyra, do you remember anything from before you came to work at the palace? Any family, any life before this one?" Her heart began pounding with a fear she couldn't name. "I told you, I don't remember much from my childhood. There was a fire when I was young, and I—" "You were saved by a loyal guard named Thomas Ashford." The name hit her like a physical blow, dragging up memories she buried so deep she convinced herself they were dreams. "He brought you here in the dead of night, begged the head steward to give you work and protection, said your family was dead and you had nowhere else to go." The silk-wrapped object in his hands caught the firelight, and she could see the outline of something small and precious beneath the fabric, something that made her chest tight with half-remembered grief. "You were 7 years old," he continued softly. "Old enough to remember your name, but young enough that the trauma made everything else fuzzy, uncertain." "Stop!" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Please, just stop." But he was already unwrapping the object, revealing a locket of tarnished silver set with a small sapphire. The sight of it hit her like a lightning bolt, dragging up memories that tasted of smoke and terror and a woman's voice singing lullabies in the darkness. "This was sewn into the lining of your dress the night you arrived," he said gently. "Thomas told the steward it was all you had left of your family, and that if anyone ever came looking for you, they should see it first." With trembling fingers, she took the locket from his hands. It was warm from his touch, familiar in a way that made her soul ache with recognition. When she pressed the tiny catch, it opened to reveal a miniature portrait, a woman with dark hair and kind eyes, holding a small child with the same delicate features. "Princess Lyra of the Northern Territories," he said quietly, "daughter of Queen Isabel and King Roland, lost in the fire that claimed the royal castle 20 years ago. Everyone believed you died with the rest of your family." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of realization through her entire world. Princess Lyra, the lost royal heir, the girl who was supposed to be dead. "No." She shook her head, taking a step backward. "That's impossible. I'm nobody. I'm just—" "You're my equal." The conviction in his voice was absolute. "You're royalty by birth, trained in service by necessity, and perfect for me in every way that matters." The locket trembled in her hands as 20 years of suppressed memories began surfacing like bubbles in champagne. A castle filled with laughter and music. A mother who smelled like roses and sang in 3 different languages. A father who taught her to read by tracing letters in flour dust on the kitchen table. And then fire, smoke, terror. A man's voice shouting at her to run, to never tell anyone her real name, to become someone else entirely until it was safe to remember who she'd been born to be. "The guard," she whispered, the pieces clicking together with devastating clarity. "Thomas, he saved me from the fire, but not just any fire, the fire that killed your parents, your brothers, your entire bloodline, except for you." His voice was gentle but relentless, forcing her to face truths she buried in service and silence. Someone wanted the Northern Territories' royal line extinct. Someone succeeded, except for one 7-year-old girl who learned to scrub floors and serve wine because it was the only way to stay alive. The room spun around her as the full weight of revelation crashed down. She wasn't just a servant who'd caught a king's attention. She was Princess Lyra, rightful heir to a kingdom that had been absorbed into his realm after her family's death. She was nobility by birth, royalty by blood, his equal in every way that mattered to the political calculations that governed their world. Why now? The question tore itself from her throat. Why tell me this now? Because someone discovered the truth. His expression darkened with a fury that reminded her exactly how dangerous the Alpha King could be when protecting what was his. Someone realized that the servant girl capturing my attention was actually the lost princess. Someone decided that was a threat that needed eliminating before I could learn your true identity. The necklace. Understanding dawned with sickening clarity. Lady Cordelia, she found out who I am. Lady Cordelia is working with others who have a vested interest in keeping the Northern Territories under central rule, rather than returning them to their rightful heir. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. Your survival threatens more than just marriage alliances. It threatens the entire political structure they've built on the assumption that your bloodline was extinct. Before she could respond, a sound echoed through the chamber that made them both freeze. The whisper of steel being drawn from sheaths, followed by Captain Thorne's voice raised in alarm. "Your Majesty, we have intruders." The door burst inward as 3 figures in dark clothing flooded into the room, weapons gleaming in the firelight. Not palace guards. Their movements were too fluid, too coordinated, too deadly. Professional assassins, come to eliminate a problem that had grown too large to ignore. "Get behind me," he ordered, but Lyra was already moving, her body responding to instincts she hadn't known she possessed. 20 years of suppressed royal training rose to the surface as she grabbed a fireplace poker and spun to face the nearest attacker. The first assassin lunged at the king, blade whistling through the air where his head had been a moment before. But he was no longer there. He was shifting, bones lengthening, muscles expanding, humanity falling away to reveal the massive black wolf that was his other half. The second assassin came for her, apparently assuming she would cower like the servant she pretended to be. Instead, she met his attack with the fireplace poker, the metal ringing against his blade with enough force to jar him backward. "You're not just a servant," she whispered to herself, the words a revelation and a battle cry combined. Light exploded around her as her own shift began, not the painful, unfamiliar transformation she'd expected, but something that felt like coming home. Her bones sang as they changed, her muscles flowing into new configurations with the ease of long practice. Power flooded through her veins, wild and pure and absolutely right. When the light faded, she stood on 4 legs instead of 2, her coat pure white with silver markings that caught the firelight like captured moonlight. The rarest of all shifter forms, the white wolf of the northern bloodlines, marking her as undeniably royal. The remaining assassin took one look at the 2 massive wolves flanking him and made a decision that spoke of wisdom over valour. He threw down his blade and raised his hands in surrender. "We yield," he said quickly. "The contract is void." In the sudden silence that followed, Lyra shifted back to human form, marvelling at how natural the transformation felt. Beside her, the king also resumed his human shape, his dark eyes blazing with something that might have been triumph. "Princess Lyra of the Northern Territories," he said formally, though his voice carried warmth that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with love. "Welcome home." She looked at him. This man who had loved her when he thought she was nobody, who had protected her when she couldn't protect herself, who had just helped her reclaim a heritage she'd forgotten she possessed, and felt the golden thread between them flare brighter than ever before. Not servant and king, princess and king, equals at last. The great hall had been transformed for the evening's formal banquet, crystal chandeliers casting brilliant light over tables laden with gold plate and exotic delicacies from across the realm. Every noble family of significance occupied their place according to ancient protocols of rank and alliance, their conversations a carefully orchestrated dance of political manoeuvring and social calculation. But tonight was different. Tonight, whispers rippled through the assembled crowd like wildfire, speculation building to a fever pitch as they waited for an announcement that would reshape the very foundations of their world. Lyra stood before the full-length mirror in her chambers, barely recognising the woman who stared back at her. Gone was the simple grey dress and white apron that had defined her identity for 20 years. In their place, she wore a gown of midnight blue silk that seemed to capture starlight in its folds, the Northern Territory's traditional ceremonial colours. A circlet of silver and sapphires rested on her dark hair. Not a crown, not yet, but unmistakably royal. "You look like her," Captain Thorne said softly from her position by the door. "Your mother. I served in the Northern Territories before the fire. You have her eyes." The words sent a flutter of something through Lyra's chest. Grief for a woman she barely remembered, pride in a heritage she was only beginning to reclaim. 20 years of believing herself nobody, and now she was about to walk into that hall as Princess Lyra, rightful heir to a kingdom everyone thought had died with her family. "Are you ready?" The king's voice came from behind her, warm and familiar despite the magnitude of what they were about to face together. She turned to find him dressed in full royal regalia, ceremonial armour polished to mirror brightness, the ancient crown of his bloodline catching the lamplight, the unmistakable bearing of absolute authority. But his eyes held the same gentle warmth she'd fallen in love with during their secret meetings in the garden. "I don't know," she admitted, smoothing her hands over the unfamiliar silk. 3 days ago I was serving wine and scrubbing floors. Now you want me to walk into that hall and convince them I'm their equal." You don't need to convince anyone." He crossed the room and took her hands in his, the gesture as natural as breathing, despite the formal grandeur of their attire. "You are their equal. You always have been. Tonight, we're simply making that truth public." Through the tall windows, she could see carriages still arriving in the courtyard below. Lords and ladies who had travelled from the farthest reaches of the kingdom to witness whatever drama the king had planned. Among them, she caught glimpse of Lady Cordelia's golden hair reflecting torchlight as she stepped from her father's ornate carriage. "She knows," Lyra said quietly. "Lady Cordelia, she has to know what you're planning to announce." "Let her know." The conviction in his voice was absolute. "Let them all know. The time for hiding is over." He offered her his arm, and she took it with hands that trembled only slightly. Together they walked toward the great hall, toward the moment that would either unite them before their people or destroy them both in full view of the entire court. The herald's voice rang out as the great doors opened before them. His Majesty, Alpha King Dominic of the realm, and Her Royal Highness, Princess Lyra of the Northern Territories. The announcement hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Conversations died mid-sentence, wine glasses frozen halfway to lips, the entire hall falling into stunned silence as they processed what they'd just heard. Princess Lyra, the lost heir, the girl everyone believed had died in flames 20 years ago. She felt every eye in the room turned toward her as they made their entrance, the weight of their stares both crushing and liberating. No more hiding in servants' quarters, no more pretending to be invisible. She was walking into this hall as exactly what she'd been born to be. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, broken only by the soft whisper of silk against marble as they approached the head table. Then, like a dam breaking, the whispers began. "Impossible. She died in the fire. Look at those eyes, those features. It's her. Gods help us all, it's really her." King Dominic led her to the chair beside his own, not a servant's place in the background, but the position of honour reserved for visiting royalty. As she took her seat, she caught sight of familiar faces in the crowd. Nobles who had barely glanced at her when she served their wine now stared with expressions ranging from shock to calculation to barely concealed fear. "My lords and ladies," the king said, his voice carrying easily through the vast space, "I present to you Princess Lyra of the Northern Territories, sole surviving heir of the royal bloodline, saved from the fire that claimed her family and raised in protection within these very walls." The murmur that rippled through the hall carried undertones of political calculation. If she was truly the northern heir, if her bloodline had survived, it changed everything. Alliances would need to be reconsidered, territorial claims reassessed, marriage contracts potentially voided. "Your Majesty." Lady Cordelia's voice cut through the whispers like a blade, sweet and poisonous in equal measure. She rose from her place among the Duke's retinue, her golden hair catching the chandelier light like spun metal. "Surely you cannot expect us to accept such an extraordinary claim without proof. A challenge, publicly delivered, impossible to ignore." Lyra felt the king tense beside her, but she was already rising from her chair. This was her moment, her chance to claim the heritage that had been stolen from her by fire and fear. "What proof would satisfy you, Lady Cordelia?" Her voice carried clearly through the hall, stronger than she'd expected. "Would you like me to recite the genealogies of the northern bloodline? Perhaps discuss the territorial agreements signed by my parents before their death?" She saw surprise flicker across Lady Cordelia's beautiful features. The servant girl who had poured her wine was speaking with the authority of someone born to rule. "Anyone could memorize such things," Lady Cordelia replied smoothly. "I speak of proof that cannot be fabricated or coached, proof that would satisfy even the most sceptical observer." "Very well." Lyra stepped away from the head table, moving to the centre of the hall where every guest could see her clearly. "The northern royal bloodline carries a gift that cannot be faked, cannot be taught, cannot be replicated by anyone not born to the ancient heritage." She closed her eyes and reached for the power that had awakened during the attack in her chambers. The shift came easier this time, her body remembering what it had always known how to do. Light blazed around her as her human form dissolved, bones and muscles flowing into new configurations with the grace of long practice. When the light faded, she stood on 4 legs instead of 2, her coat pure white with silver markings that seemed to capture and reflect the chandelier light. The white wolf of the northern bloodlines, the rarest of all shifter forms, appearing only in those carrying the most ancient and pure royal heritage. The hall erupted in gasps and exclamations. Several nobles actually fell to their knees, recognizing the significance of what they were witnessing. The White Wolf hadn't been seen in the realm for 20 years, not since the night Princess Lyra had supposedly died with the rest of her family. She shifted back to human form, the transformation as natural as breathing. In the stunned silence that followed, she looked directly at Lady Cordelia, who had gone pale as winter snow. "Is that proof sufficient, my lady?" Lady Cordelia's composure cracked, revealing the calculation and fury beneath her perfect facade. "This changes nothing," she said, her voice rising with desperation. "Royal blood or not, she was raised as a servant. She knows nothing of ruling, nothing of the political realities that govern kingdoms. She would be a liability, not an asset." "You dare!" The king's voice cut through her protests like a blade, carrying the full weight of his authority and his fury. He rose from his chair, and every person in the hall could feel the power radiating from him. Not just political authority, but the raw dominance of an alpha wolf pushed beyond patience. "She dares question my mate's worthiness to stand beside me?" His eyes blazed with protective fire as he moved to Lyra's side. "This woman who has survived assassination attempts, who has proven her courage and her royal heritage before your very eyes?" He pulled Lyra close, his arm encircling her waist in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. The bond between them flared visible for a moment, a golden light that connected them heart to heart, soul to soul, making their connection undeniable to every shifter in the room. "Princess Lyra is not only my chosen mate," he declared, his voice ringing through the hall with absolute conviction. "She is my equal in every way that matters, born to royalty, tested by hardship, proven in courage. She will stand beside me as my queen, and anyone who questions her right to do so questions me." The formal words of claiming echoed through the hall, binding them together before witnesses according to the oldest laws of their people. Around them, the assembled nobles began to kneel, first a few, then more, then the entire hall bowing before their king and his chosen queen. All except Lady Cordelia, who stood frozen in place, her beautiful face twisted with rage and defeat. "Guards," the king commanded quietly, "escort Lady Cordelia and her father to their chambers. I believe they'll want to pack for an early departure." As the guards moved to comply, Lady Cordelia's mask finally slipped completely. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Both of you. A king who chooses heart over duty, a pretender who thinks royal blood makes up for common breeding. You'll destroy everything." "No," Lyra said quietly, her voice somehow carrying despite its softness. "We'll build something better, something based on love instead of fear, on truth instead of political convenience." The guards escorted Lady Cordelia from the hall, her protests fading as the great doors closed behind them. In the silence that followed, King Dominic turned to face his court, his arm still around Lyra's waist, the bond between them glowing soft and warm. "Let it be recorded in the Royal Chronicles," he announced. "On this day, Princess Lyra of the Northern Territories accepted my proposal of marriage. The wedding will take place in 1 month's time, uniting not just 2 hearts, but 2 kingdoms in an alliance that will strengthen us all." The hall erupted in celebration, not the careful, calculated approval of political manoeuvring, but genuine joy from people who recognized true love when they saw it. Musicians struck up a wedding song, wine flowed freely, and the dancing began with the king leading his future queen onto the floor. As they moved together in the ancient steps of the royal wedding dance, Lyra marvelled at how natural it felt. Not servant and master, not commoner and king, but two equals who had found their way to each other despite every obstacle the world had placed between them. "No regrets," he whispered as they spun through the familiar steps, their bodies moving in perfect harmony. She looked up into his dark eyes, seeing the man who had loved her when she was nobody, who had protected her when she couldn't protect herself, who had helped her reclaim the heritage she'd never known she'd lost. "Only one," she replied, smiling as his eyebrows rose in question. "I regret every day we spent pretending not to know each other. We should have trusted this from the beginning." He spun her in a perfect circle, her silk skirts flaring around them like captured starlight. When she came back into his arms, he pressed his forehead against hers, the gesture intimate despite their very public setting. "We have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time," he murmured, "starting now." Around them, their court danced and celebrated, the political crisis resolved, the future secure. But all Lyra could focus on was the golden thread that bound them together, singing with the kind of joy that came from finally being able to love without fear, without hiding, without pretending to be anything other than exactly what they were. Two halves of the same soul, united at last before the world. 3 months later, the morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of the royal chapel, casting jewelled patterns across the ancient stone floor. The entire kingdom had gathered to witness what the chroniclers would later call the wedding of two crowns, the union of King Dominic and Princess Lyra that would officially restore the northern territories to their rightful heir, while binding two realms in an alliance built on love rather than conquest. Lyra stood before the silver mirror in the bridal chamber, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting who had once been her fellow servants. She had insisted on keeping them close, these women who had shared her struggles and small joys during the years when she believed herself nobody. Now they fussed over the intricate beadwork of her wedding gown, with the same careful attention they had once given to laundering nobles' silk. "You look like a fairy tale," whispered Mira, the kitchen maid, who now served as her personal attendant. "Like something out of the old stories our grandmothers used to tell." The gown was a masterwork of northern tradition, white silk embroidered with silver thread that caught the light like captured moonbeams, the bodice fitted with pearls from the deep mountain lakes of her ancestral homeland. But it was the crown resting on the velvet cushion beside her that truly took her breath away. Not the simple circlet she had worn at the betrothal announcement, but the full crown of the Northern Territories, recovered from the ruins of her childhood castle and restored to its ancient glory. Sapphires the colour of winter sky alternated with silver wolves, frozen in eternal hunt around the band, each gem representing one of the noble houses that had served her bloodline for 1,000 years. "Are you nervous?" asked Sarah, now her lady-in-waiting, as she fastened a necklace of northern pearls around Lyra's throat. "Terrified," Lyra admitted with a laugh. "Not about marrying him, about everything that comes after. Ruling a kingdom, making decisions that affect thousands of lives, living up to the legacy of my parents." "You've been preparing for this your whole life," Elena said softly. The elderly woman had become something like a mother figure during the weeks of wedding preparations. "You may not have known it, but every hardship you faced as a servant, every moment you chose kindness over bitterness, every time you protected someone weaker than yourself, that was preparation. You learned to see the kingdom from the ground up, to understand what your people truly need." Through the tall windows, Lyra could hear the sounds of celebration already beginning in the courtyard below. Merchants had travelled from every corner of both kingdoms to set up their stalls. Musicians filled the air with traditional wedding songs, and the aroma of festival foods drifted through the palace corridors. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come," she called, expecting one of the pages with a final message about the ceremony schedule. Instead, King Dominic stepped into the chamber, resplendent in midnight blue velvet embroidered with gold thread, the ancient crown of his bloodline catching the morning light. Tradition demanded they not see each other before the ceremony, but since when had they ever followed tradition? "Bad luck to see the bride before the wedding," Mira protested with mock seriousness. "I make my own luck," he replied, though his eyes never left Lyra's face. "Ladies, would you give us a moment?" When they were alone, he crossed the room and took her hands in his, careful not to disturb the intricate lacework of her sleeves. "You're beautiful," he said simply. "But more than that, you're radiant, like you've finally stepped into the life you were always meant to live." "I'm scared," she admitted, the confession easier to voice now that they had learned to trust each other with their deepest fears. "What if I'm not good enough? What if the nobles who accepted me publicly still doubt me privately? What if I can't live up to what my parents built?" "Then you'll build something different," he said with quiet conviction. "Something better. Something that reflects who you are, not who you think you should be." He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to each palm. "You've already changed this kingdom just by existing in it. The servant protection laws you suggested, the agricultural reforms based on what you learned working in the palace kitchens, the way you've brought former servants into positions of real authority. You're not ruling like a traditional princess. You're ruling like someone who understands both power and powerlessness." The sound of trumpets echoed from the chapel, signalling that the ceremony would begin soon. But before they could be swept up in the pageantry and politics of a royal wedding, she needed to ask the question that had been haunting her for weeks. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd met differently?" she said quietly. "If I'd been raised as a princess from the beginning, if you'd courted me properly with all the formal protocols and political considerations?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with the seriousness they deserved. "I think we would have missed each other entirely," he said finally. "I would have seen another political alliance, another calculated match designed to strengthen borders and secure treaties. You would have seen another duty, another role to play for the good of the kingdom. Instead, I fell in love with a woman who showed me how to see starlight in puddles and taught me that power means nothing if you don't use it to protect what matters. You fell in love with a man who held your hand during thunderstorms and shared his deepest fears with someone he thought was just a servant." His thumb traced across her knuckles, the gesture achingly familiar despite their formal attire. "We found each other's souls before we ever knew each other's names." The trumpet sounded again, closer this time, accompanied by the rustle of hundreds of guests taking their places in the chapel. But Lyra felt perfectly calm now, centred in the certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. "Ready, my love?" he asked, offering her his arm with the same gallant gesture he'd used in their garden meetings. "Ready," she replied, taking his arm and letting him escort her toward the life they would build together. The chapel doors opened to reveal a sight that would be painted by artists for generations to come. Every pew filled with nobility from both kingdoms, their formal court dress creating a tapestry of colours and textures that spoke of wealth and power. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, depicting the ancient legends of both bloodlines, casting rainbow patterns across the assembled crowd. But it was the altar that drew every eye, ancient stone carved with symbols of unity and eternity, draped with garlands of white roses and northern mountain laurel. The high priest waited there in robes of ceremonial gold, the traditional wedding chalice gleaming beside him. As they walked down the aisle together, another break with tradition, but one that felt absolutely right, Lyra marvelled at how different everything looked from this perspective. No longer was she invisible, moving through the spaces between important people. Now she was at the centre of it all, walking toward a future that belonged to her as much as to him. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of ancient words and sacred rituals. They spoke the traditional vows, but she barely heard them, too focused on his face, on the way his eyes held hers throughout every word. When the time came to exchange rings, he slipped the Northern Royal wedding band onto her finger, white gold set with sapphires that had belonged to her mother, her grandmother, and generations of queens before them. "By the ancient laws of our people," the high priest intoned, "and in the sight of all gathered here, I pronounce you husband and wife, king and queen, united in bond and blessed by fate. You may kiss your bride, your majesty." The kiss was soft, reverent, mindful of their audience, but carrying an undertone of promise that made her pulse quicken. When they broke apart, the chapel erupted in celebration, cheers and applause, and the ringing of bells from every tower in the kingdom. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Lyra caught sight of familiar faces in the crowd. Thomas Ashford, the guard who had saved her from the fire, now elderly but beaming with pride. The servants who had shared her quarters, dressed in their finest clothes and weeping happy tears. Even some of the nobles who had initially questioned her right to the throne now smiled with what looked like genuine joy. The feast that followed was legendary, tables laden with delicacies from both kingdoms, wine flowing like water, music and dancing that continued long into the night. But the moment that would stay with Lyra forever came during the traditional royal dance, when she and Dominic took the floor for the first time as king and queen. "Any regrets?" he asked as they moved through the intricate steps, their bodies fitting together with the kind of perfection that came from souls recognizing their match. She looked up into his dark eyes, seeing the man who had loved her when she was nobody, who had protected her when she couldn't protect herself, who had helped her become the woman she was always meant to be. "Only one," she said, echoing the conversation they'd had at their betrothal ceremony. "I regret every moment we spent hiding our love, every day we pretended not to know each other's hearts." "Then we'll make up for it," he promised, spinning her in a perfect circle before drawing her close again. "We'll love each other openly, honestly, completely. We'll rule with the same transparency we wish we'd shown from the beginning." As the music swirled around them, Lyra thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From servant girl to princess, from secret meetings to public claiming, from impossible love to a marriage that would reshape the political landscape of their world. But more than that, she thought about the future they would build together. A kingdom where worth wasn't determined by birth alone, where compassion mattered as much as strength, where love could indeed conquer the seemingly impossible. The dancing continued until nearly dawn, but eventually the celebration wound down and the guests began departing for their various holdings. As the last carriage disappeared into the morning mist, Lyra and Dominic found themselves alone in the garden where it had all begun, their secret sanctuary, now officially theirs, to enjoy without fear or hiding. "It's strange," she said, settling beside him on the stone bench near the fountain. "For so long, this place felt stolen, like we were borrowing moments that didn't really belong to us. And now it feels like coming home." She leaned against his shoulder, marvelling at how natural the gesture felt even in their formal wedding attire. "Like we've finally stopped running towards something and can just be." He wrapped his arm around her, pressing a kiss to the crown of sapphires that now adorned her head. "Queen Lyra of the Northern Territories," he said softly. "It suits you." "Queen Lyra, wife of King Dominic, partner in all things," she corrected with a smile. "That suits me even better." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, painting the garden in shades of gold and green. Around them, the kingdom they would rule together was beginning to wake. Merchants opening their shops, farmers heading to their fields, children playing in village squares. All of it now under their protection, their guidance, their shared vision of what a realm could become when love rather than fear shaped its laws. "Do you know what I realised during the ceremony?" Lyra said eventually. "What's that?" "We never did properly introduce ourselves." She turned in his arms, eyes sparkling with mischief. "I'm Princess Lyra of the Northern Territories, lost heir, former servant, and woman who believes in love over duty." "King Dominic of the realm," he replied gravely, though his eyes danced with matching humour. Alpha Wolf, protector of the innocent, and man who learned that the best queens are forged in adversity rather than born in luxury. Pleased to make your acquaintance, Your Majesty. The pleasure is entirely mine, Your Majesty. Then they were kissing again, soft and sweet and full of promise, while around them the garden bloomed in celebration of a love that had found its way home at last. Where are you listening from tonight? I love hearing from fellow dreamers who believe in love that sees past masks and titles. If you'd like to support more stories like this, please subscribe. It's free and helps these tales reach others who need to hear that sometimes the most impossible love stories are the ones most worth fighting for.